and I fly up north most every day, and I fly. It's always been my way.
Okay, you're clear. Clear!
Hi, Dave Hadfield here, and the mission today is pilot proficiency checks. Once a year, some grumpy old fart like me sits in the back and annoys the pilots up front as I evaluate them. And I don't get too brutal about it because I got to go up there too on my own PPC. But more seriously, it is a necessary requirement. You never really know what's going on in another pilot's brain until you fly with them. Anyway, I really admired the way the guys handled their forced approaches this year in the Cornell, the Warbird, and the Finch, so that's what this video is about. I have the great pleasure of flying with Jonathan, who's been part of our Yellow Wings group for over 10 years. The aircraft we're using first is a Fairchild PT-26 Cornell. They came on strength with the RCAF in 1942 as a primary trainer. This one was built by Fleet Industries in Fort Erie, Ontario, and is immaculate. By the way, that interesting looking biplane is a de Havilland Fox Moth. I've had a lot of fun in that one. So let's talk about the most critical forced landing, and that's the one that happens after takeoff when you're only a couple of hundred feet up. If the engine quits then, the first thing you do is rotate the nose down. Never mind any instruments or procedures, just pick a nose down attitude where it obviously won't stall, and then fly the airplane. Vintage aircraft, particularly biplanes, run out of energy incredibly fast in this situation. The nose down reaction has to be immediate. No turns, except maybe to dodge the approach lights at the other end. You haven't got time for checklists, procedures, or to talk on the radio. Maybe switch tanks, if you can find the valve without going heads down. Make sure your fuel pump's on, or if you have an electric primer, give that a shot. But basically fly the airplane back to the earth. Now, we don't practice that, actual engine cuts immediately after takeoff in these vintage airplanes. It's hard on the engines, and it adds too much risk. Better to do that training in a modern airplane with a modern engine, but we certainly do brief it. So I'm going to skip over all the upper air work we do in a PPC, stalls, and coordination maneuvers, and get to the practice forced approaches, which is what this video is about. At this point, the pilot, Jonathan, has done a couple of touch and goes, and if he's paying attention, he knows what's going to happen next. My hand reaches up to the left, pulls off the throttle, and I say on the intercom, engine failure. He immediately nails the glide speed, 80 miles an hour, and evaluates his flight path. He's kept this circuit fairly tight, so he doesn't have to do an immediate steep turn to an approach, but he doesn't waste any time and certainly not any altitude. Next, over the intercom, he goes through all the engine restart items and then the engine shutdown and preparation for forced landing items. There's construction at the airport today. You may have seen those orange cones marking the displaced threshold before we took off. So Jonathan's staying high. His aim point is halfway down the runway. There's 6,000 feet of pavement, so aiming halfway down allows a little room for error on the approach. At this point, when he's absolutely certain he's got the field made, he initiates a slipping turn to final to lose altitude. Jonathan owns a small biplane, so this is a technique he's very familiar with, and I like it too. You can adjust the drag quickly and easily, increase or decrease. A Cornell has flaps, but frankly they're a bit clunky, and he doesn't use them much. Over the cones, straighten out, get the 80, flare, and if you can tell when he's touching down, you're better than me, because I can't. It was feather smooth. And the next task is to get the tail down without shimmy, which Cornells are known for, And he manages that too. Great work. A really excellent job. Next up is Rob B. in the Fleet Finch. Rob is another long-standing Yellow Wings pilot with us. Our Finch is a 16B built in 1940 during the early days of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. It was also built by Fleet Industries in Fort Erie. So, same as before, climb up, coordination maneuvers, chandelles, lazy eights, lots of different kinds of stalls, and then back to the circuit. And then again, some nasty guy in the back seat pulls off the throttle and says, "Engine failure." Rob immediately establishes his target airspeed of 70 miles an hour, and then, being in a very draggy biplane, pays great attention to his approach path, choosing the exact point to turn to land on the spot he's chosen on the airfield. At this point, he's talking me through the engine restart procedure, and assuming it's not going to restart, the forced landing procedure. I look left frequently. My secondary job is to watch for traffic. The ball never leaves the center. The speed stays at 70. Rob's going to land in the grass, and he's chosen a touchdown point just beyond a service lane where there's a bump. You'll be able to see it by a gap in the cornfield, and he side slips as required to adjust the profile. Past the bump, set up for a 3-point, hold her off, and sweet. Both Rob and Jonathan work with the Air Cadet Gliding Program. They're tow pilots, instructors, and it shows. Now we've got Joe in the Mark IV Harvard. Joe is another long-standing volunteer pilot with us. He's checked out on the Hurricane, the P-40, and owns several airplanes, including a Stearman. Our Harvard is a Mark IV, built in 1952 in Canada by Canadian Car and Foundry in Fort William. It's the only Harvard in the world to score a victory over an Avro Arrow. I kid you not. It's a bit of a painful story, but like the fighter pilots say, a kill's a kill. So this video is about practiced forced approaches, but let me just include a couple of stalls. The Cornell and the Finch are very benign. They both stall not much different than a 172. But the Harvard? No, it drops a wing. It takes quick, accurate rudder work for Joe to correct that. Here's another in a left turn with power on, and the right wing drops. Again, corrected with rudder and elevator. It only looks like a non-event because it's handled correctly. Same thing, power on turn to the right, and sharp left wing drop. This all makes sense aerodynamically, but a Harvard is famous for not being quite so predictable. You really do have to be on your toes, quite literally, and it's the reason we do quite a few stalls during the PPC. Anyway, let's fast forward to the circuit. You see the way Joe is keeping his downwind leg fairly close to the runway? That's pretty prudent on a check ride. Not his first day in the airplane, because sure enough, that darn guy in the back seat pulls the power off and says, "Engine failure again." Joe initiates the turn even before he's abeam the end of the runway. He delays extending the gear and the flap, and he pulls the prop pitch to course. All of these things extend the glide. Also, the normal power-on approach speed is 80 knots in a Harvard. Joe's keeping a few knots in the bank and targeting 90. Over the intercom, he's reciting the engine relight procedures, and no luck, moves to the forced approach preparation. But he hardly ever takes his eyes off the runway, looking well down the pavement for a touchdown point. When he's sure he's got the field made, it's gear down, and when he's doubly sure he's got the field made, at least some flap. Now, watch during the flare here how fast the aircraft runs out of energy, how quickly the airspeed decreases. Good, straightforward 3-point, right on the 1,000-foot marks. Very nice. I'm done. Now, obviously these practice forced approaches were done in the most favorable situation from the downwind leg. We all recognize that's not totally realistic, but in Canada, in the springtime, the fields are mud. And if you were doing a practice forced approach and got low, and then tried to open up the throttle and the engine wasn't there, it sure would be nice to have pavement available. So that's why we do it in this way. It's a balance of training value versus risk. It's also a great day's flying, and at the end of it, there's quite a feeling of accomplishment, and you really do feel prepared for the display season to come. And I fly up north most every day, and I fly, it's always been my way. I've been up here for far too long, but I still like what I see, 'cause I live here in the north, and the north lives here in